Now to Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. A year after Ukrainian troops liberated the southern city of Kherson from Russian occupation, shelling and missile attacks remain a constant of daily life. Ukraine has been able to advance further into Russian-held territory in recent days, but Kherson is barely a kilometer from the front line. DW Special Correspondent Max Zander visited the city to talk to residents about how they're dealing with the unrelenting threat.
A year after liberation, Kherson is still a dangerous place to be.
So 3 people were traveling in this car when it was hit earlier today by Russian shelling. From what we know, the driver was instantly killed. A 2-month-old baby received an injury to the head, and the mother was seriously wounded. She had to be brought to a hospital and is currently fighting for her life.
This is the baby girl, in the arms of a Ukrainian police officer, being rushed to hospital. A year after Russian forces retreated, much of the city is still a war zone. And medical facilities like this maternity hospital remain in harm's way. Medical Director Oksana Tomchenko shows us what the Russians have done since leaving. They didn't go very far. From the roof, we can see the left bank of the river, from where Russian troops continue to attack the city.
During the occupation, when our city was shelled, it was point shelling, aimed at where the Russian military was stationed. The strikes were directed. Since the deoccupation, the Russians shoot wherever they want.
In the year before the war, 1,200 children were born here. Now, Oksana Tomchenko says they have about 1/10 of that.
It breaks my heart that we have so few births here. I understand it's safer for women to be elsewhere, but that's our job.
Irina plans to have her baby here, despite the risks.
They are shooting, shells are constantly flying, and it makes you very nervous. You fall asleep and you don't know whether you will wake up or not, to be honest.
She already has 2 daughters, one born before the war, the other during occupation. She doesn't want to give up on the future of her family here.
We want, as parents, to show our children by our example that we need to believe in the best. We need to strive for something in our lives.
But it's been hard. Irina tells us her husband was taken prisoner during the occupation. She says their neighbor, a supposed friend, betrayed them to the Russians. This kind of betrayal has caused social traumas that will need healing in this city.
During the occupation, some of our employees were sure, I will quote now, that Russia is here forever. They were sure of it, and even spoke openly about it.
The occupation has left a complicated legacy for those who remain.
Open collaborators, those who openly supported them, no one will forgive them. Those who had to adapt, we do not call them collaborators. That is different.
1 year later, trauma runs deep in Kherson city. And with the Russians on its doorstep, the danger is far from over. As we leave, the shelling begins once again.
Let's bring in DW correspondent Nick Connolly here in Kyiv. Nick, are Ukrainians confident that things are going to get better in this war, or have they resigned themselves to the current status quo?
Well, certainly, if you look at the last 6 months, the counteroffensive hasn't been able to make the progress that it was expected of it, at least Internationally, I think the hopes have been very high after what Ukraine was able to do last autumn, and we've seen that the Russians have dug in along most of the 1,000-kilometre-long front line with minefields and trenches that are basically impossible to cross without huge losses to the advancing side. Especially Kherson, that was liberated by Ukrainian forces last November, has actually seen a reduction in population. Now only about 30 to 40,000 people believed to still live there, compared to about 300,000 before the war. And those attacks are relentless. I was just looking at the local news from Kherson, and the local governor was saying that there had been around 120 attacks of various kinds, either glide bombs or artillery, over the last 24 hours in the Kherson region. A lot of that in the city. You see people dying at bus stops, people just at home, people going to shops. Really, this is not a safe place to be because it is so close to the Russian artillery positions on the other side of the Dnieper River. Having said that, I think Kherson, that region, is basically the only kind of bright spot for the Ukrainian army right now. It is the only section of the front line where the Russians haven't had a chance to dig in and build those fortifications. And we have in recent days been getting reports that especially Ukrainian special forces have been establishing a few bridgeheads on the other side of the river, on the east bank. And there's real kind of worry and in some parts kind of hysteria even among the Russian military bloggers that this could be the place where Ukraine pushes forwards. Obviously, it's very, very difficult sending small groups of troops on little motorized boats across the river without a bridge, without kind of heavy tech on their side. But certainly there is a sense that Kherson could soon maybe be less under attack, fewer artillery attacks, because the Russians would be just that much further.
Ukraine, of course, is heavily dependent on supplies of weaponry from its allies. What are Ukraine's leaders saying about the level of support that they're currently getting from those allies in this war, Nick?
I think the picture all through this war has been, at least seen from Kyiv, too little, too late. Promises, words of solidarity, but then a failure to actually realise on those promises. And there is certainly a lot of worry here about the political uncertainty in the US, funding for Ukraine no longer being the kind of bipartisan issue that it was. Now news from Germany about the German budget and worries that Germany might be saving on any expenditure that's not seen as totally necessary. Having said that, there is always a huge lag between the kind of political decision-making and the delivery to the front lines. So for now, Ukraine is actually still getting a lot of supplies that were promised some time ago. It's recently drawn basically even in terms of artillery shells with Russia. It has fewer of them, but they're more precise. And then we had Germany's Defense Minister Pistorius in town yesterday promising more air defense systems, if not the kind of long-range missiles that Ukraine has been asking of Germany all along. So certainly a real kind of reversal. If you think back to the beginning of the war, where Germany was seen as one of the most reluctant countries to supply weapons, Germany now, after the US, the second biggest supplier of weapons to Ukraine.
You mentioned the German defense minister's visit there yesterday, Nick. We just saw some pictures of him there a moment ago. We also had European Council President Charles Michel in Kyiv yesterday as well, meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Tell us more about those visits.
Well, so this was partly just to show solidarity and to prove to Ukrainians that they haven't fallen off the agenda since world attention shifted to Gaza. It was also connected to the 10th anniversary of those Maidan protests that were all about Ukrainians demanding closer ties to Europe. Back then, EU membership seemed pretty much unreal, kind of long distance kind of hope. That now is drawing closer. He did, though, say, Charles Michel said that it wasn't up to him to start those negotiations, that Ukrainians would basically have to convince all 27 member states. And Viktor Orban, as we know, is threatening a veto. So difficult times, but certainly there is a timeline, and there's a real hope that Ukraine could, in years to come, become a full EU member.
Nick, thank you very much for your reporting. That was our correspondent, Nick Connolly, there in Kyiv.